You know, some stories stick with you, the kind you can't shake off no matter how much time passes. That's exactly how I felt when I first learned about what happened to Lauren Kavanaugh. It's not just shocking, it's the kind of story that makes you question how such unimaginable cruelty could happen. Let's go back to June 11th, 2001 in Hutchins, Texas. This was a quiet little town where life moved at a slower pace, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. But on that day, the peace of the town was shattered. Police officers were called to the home of Kenneth and Barbara Atkinson. The call they received was about child abuse, specifically concerning an 8-year-old girl named Lauren Kavanaugh. Child abuse calls are always difficult, but what the officers walked into that day was beyond anything they could have prepared for. When the first officer entered the home, he was struck by what he saw. In the corner of the house there was a tiny figure, so frail and thin that he assumed it was a toddler. But as he looked closer, he realized this wasn't a 2-year-old. This was Lauren Kavanaugh, an 8-year-old girl. Can you imagine the shock of seeing a child so small, so malnourished, that her age was unrecognizable? The officers wasted no time. They knew this was a serious situation, and Lauren was rushed out of the house and taken to a hospital in Dallas. At the hospital, doctors quickly began examining her, and what they found was nothing short of heartbreaking. Lauren wasn't just underweight, she was the size of a typical 2-year-old. Her body showed clear signs of long-term starvation and severe neglect. It became obvious that this wasn't just a case of abuse, it was something much darker. The medical team and law enforcement knew they needed to uncover the full story, and as they started piecing things together, the truth was even worse than anyone had imagined. Lauren's condition didn't happen overnight. What they were seeing was the result of years of unimaginable cruelty and neglect. Now picture that moment for a second. An officer walks into what seems like just another house, but instead of finding a typical family environment, they find this. The smell of neglect in the air, a refrigerator that's nearly empty, and a child who looks like she's barely survived. Can you imagine what must have been going through the officers' minds? They were trained for tough situations, but this was unlike anything they had seen before. And then there was Lauren herself. She was so weak she couldn't stand. Her ribs were visible through her pale skin. Her hair was falling out, and her eyes, though they said nothing, spoke volumes about the suffering she had endured. She didn't even have the energy to cry. This was a child who had been through so much pain, yet somehow she was still alive. The scene was a grim puzzle, and investigators knew they needed to find out what had led to this moment. What kind of life had Lauren been living in that house? The answers they found were not just shocking, they were deeply disturbing. The scars on Lauren's body weren't just physical marks. They were evidence of years of torment, a life stolen from her by those who were supposed to protect her. As the investigation unfolded, the details of Lauren's life painted a picture of horror that no one could have anticipated. This wasn't just neglect, it was a calculated systemic abuse that defied comprehension. Let's go back to where Lauren Kavanaugh's story began. She was born on April 12, 1993, in Texas, but even before she took her first breath, her life was already set on a path of uncertainty. Her biological mother, Barbara Atkinson, had made the decision to give Lauren up for adoption. For Barbara, this choice might have been an escape from responsibility, but for another family, it was the start of what they thought would be a beautiful new chapter. Sabrina and Bill Kavanaugh were the couple chosen to adopt Lauren. They were so eager to welcome her into their family that Sabrina was in the delivery room when Lauren was born. Can you imagine that moment? A tiny baby entering the world, completely innocent and full of potential, surrounded by love from people who had been dreaming about her arrival. Sabrina later described the day as the happiest day of their lives. "We loved her before she was born, I guess you would say," she recalled. You can almost feel the joy in her words. She and Bill had prepared everything, a cozy nursery filled with tiny clothes, toys, and all the things they imagined Lauren would need. It was the kind of excitement that every hopeful parent feels when they're about to bring a child into their home. For the Kavanaughs, Lauren wasn't just a baby, she was a dream come true. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the love they must have felt as they brought Lauren home for the first time, holding her in their arms, marveling at her tiny hands and feet, and picturing all the milestones ahead. First steps, first words, birthdays, school days, it was all ahead of them. Sabrina and Bill believed they were starting a beautiful journey with their new daughter. But as joyful as this beginning was, it was overshadowed by a terrible storm brewing on the horizon. While the Kavanaughs were thrilled to raise Lauren as their own, her biological mother Barbara began to have second thoughts. It wasn't long before she decided she wanted her daughter back, and that decision would set off a chain of events that would change Lauren's life forever. It's hard not to think about what might have been. If Lauren had stayed with the Kavanaughs, would her story have been one of love, safety, and happiness? Would she have grown up in the home that Sabrina and Bill had so lovingly prepared for her? These are the heartbreaking questions that linger when you think about what Lauren endured later in life. For a brief moment, Lauren Kavanaugh was surrounded by nothing but love and hope. The Kavanaughs believed they were the family who would give her the life she deserved. But as we'll see, that happiness was short-lived, and Lauren's life would soon take a dark and unimaginable turn. For the first few months of her life, Lauren Kavanaugh was a happy baby. Sabrina and Bill Kavanaugh showered her with love, giving her the care and attention every child deserves. They treated her as if she were their own because in their hearts she already was. But that happiness wouldn't last. Everything changed in 1995 when Lauren's biological mother, Barbara Atkinson, regained custody of her. That decision marked the beginning of a nightmare that would define Lauren's childhood. Let's take a step back for a moment. Sabrina had first met Barbara months before Lauren was born. Barbara was just 21 at the time, already pregnant and struggling with the reality of becoming a mother. Sabrina later recalled how Barbara had seemed determined to give her baby up for adoption. She had no idea who the father was, Sabrina said, explaining the difficult position Barbara was in. The two women met several times before Lauren's birth to discuss the logistics of the adoption. From all accounts, Barbara was firm in her decision. She wasn't ready to be a parent and wanted Lauren to have a better life with the Kavanaughs. For the first 8 months of Lauren's life, it seemed like everything was going according to plan. Sabrina and Bill loved her deeply, giving her the kind of stable and nurturing environment every baby needs. Lauren was thriving, and the Kavanaughs were blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Then, out of nowhere, they received the news that Barbara had filed a petition to regain custody of Lauren. Can you imagine how devastating that must have been for Sabrina and Bill? They had poured their hearts into raising Lauren, only to face the possibility of losing her. For Sabrina, this wasn't just a legal battle, it was a fight for the future of a child she already considered her daughter. But the court system doesn't always see things the way a parent does. In 1995, Judge Lynn E. Markham awarded permanent custody of Lauren to Barbara Atkinson and her husband Kenneth. The Kavanaughs were heartbroken, and for good reason. They knew Barbara wasn't equipped to care for Lauren. They knew she wasn't ready to be a mother. But despite their fears, the court's decision was final. Lauren was taken from the only home she had ever known and placed back in the care of Barbara and Kenneth Atkinson. What happened next is almost too horrific to put into words. For the next 6 years, Lauren endured unimaginable abuse at the hands of the Atkinsons. The bright and happy baby who had once thrived in the Kavanaugh's care was subjected to a life of torment and neglect. The details of those years are painful to recount, but they paint a picture of the kind of cruelty no child should ever have to experience. It's hard not to wonder how things might have turned out if Lauren had stayed with Sabrina and Bill. They had been ready to give her everything: a safe home, a loving family, and a future full of possibilities. Instead, the custody battle tore her away from that life, setting her on a path of unimaginable suffering. This moment in Lauren's story is a heartbreaking reminder of how crucial early decisions can be. The court's ruling didn't just change where Lauren lived, it changed the entire trajectory of her life. What should have been a childhood filled with love and happiness became a nightmare of abuse and survival. According to medical reports, Lauren Kavanaugh's growth stalled when she was just 2 years old. This was the same age when she was taken from the loving arms of her adoptive parents and returned to the custody of her biological mother, Barbara Atkinson. For Lauren, this marked the beginning of a harrowing chapter of unimaginable suffering and neglect. Her body's inability to grow was a silent reflection of the horrors she endured, a physical manifestation of the abuse that defined her early years. In reality, Lauren's life was confined to a small, dark closet in her mother's home. This cramped space, meant for storage, became her prison for much of her childhood. Imagine a young child sitting in the darkness, surrounded by the stale air of isolation, with nothing but her thoughts and fears to keep her company. The closet wasn't just a physical space. It was a place where Lauren's world shrank to nothingness, where the basic joys of childhood were stolen from her. Her diet was meager and sporadic. She survived on cold soup, crackers, and occasionally tubs of butter that her older sister would secretly sneak into the closet. These small offerings, though far from nutritious, were acts of defiance and love from her sister, who risked her own safety to give Lauren a momentary reprieve from starvation. It's heartbreaking to imagine a child so desperate for food that a tub of butter felt like a blessing. However, the closet was not a sanctuary. On the rare occasions Lauren was allowed to leave, she faced even greater horrors than the loneliness and deprivation inside. From a disturbingly young age, she was subjected to severe mistreatment by both Kenneth and Barbara Atkinson. The very people entrusted with her care betrayed her in the most appalling ways, robbing her of her innocence and dignity. But the abuse didn't end with them. Tragically, Lauren was also exploited by others when Kenneth and Barbara allowed it. They didn't just fail to protect her, they facilitated her suffering. By exposing her to further harm, they turned their daughter into a victim not only of their own cruelty, but of others as well. This added layer of betrayal is almost too much to comprehend. Lauren's childhood was stripped of every fundamental need: love, safety, nourishment, and freedom. Her existence in the closet symbolized more than just physical confinement. It was a constant reminder of the emotional isolation and fear that consumed her every waking moment. The darkness of that space mirrored the darkness of her circumstances, a place where even the faintest glimmer of hope struggled to survive. The cruelty Lauren Kavanaugh endured went beyond physical neglect and abuse. It was psychological torment as well, the kind that cut as deeply as any other form of harm. Barbara Atkinson, her biological mother, would sometimes place a bowl of macaroni and cheese in front of Lauren, a rare moment that might have given the child a glimmer of hope. But this was no act of kindness. Instead, Barbara would coldly instruct her, "Chew it, but don't swallow." Can you imagine the agony of being so hungry, your body desperate for food, only to have it cruelly dangled in front of you as part of a twisted game? It was as though Barbara took pleasure in denying Lauren even the smallest comfort. What makes this even more disturbing is that Lauren wasn't an only child. Kenneth and Barbara had 5 other children in the household. While these children were subjected to various forms of abuse, none of them were treated with the same level of contempt and neglect as Lauren. She was the one they singled out, the one they isolated, the one they confined to a dark closet for years on end. Barbara's complete lack of maternal instinct toward Lauren was chillingly clear. In her later interviews with Child Protective Services, she openly admitted, "I never loved Lauren. I never wanted her." Those words alone are devastating to hear. But she didn't stop there. She added, "When my other children suffer, I suffer as well. I felt nothing when Lauren was in pain." Think about that for a moment. A mother admitting without hesitation that she felt nothing when her child was in pain. It's hard to fathom that level of detachment, that absence of empathy. For Barbara, Lauren wasn't a daughter to nurture and protect. She was a burden, an object of disdain. That attitude permeated every decision Barbara made, turning Lauren's childhood into a living nightmare. The stark contrast between how Lauren was treated and how the other children were treated, even in a home rife with abuse, underscores just how deeply Barbara's hatred for her ran. Why was Lauren singled out? Was it because she was a reminder of decisions Barbara regretted? Or was it simply that Barbara and Kenneth found a vulnerable target in her and used her as an outlet for their own twisted impulses? These are questions that may never have clear answers, but they linger as a haunting backdrop to Lauren's story. The psychological impact of this treatment can't be overstated. Lauren wasn't just starved of food, she was starved of love, of basic human connection, of the sense of worth that every child deserves to feel. Barbara's cruel words and actions weren't just about inflicting pain, they were about erasing Lauren's very sense of self. And yet, even in the face of such calculated cruelty, Lauren survived. Her ability to endure such torment is both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. It's a reminder of the depths of human resilience, even when faced with unimaginable darkness. After 6 long, torturous years of confinement and abuse, the unimaginable finally happened. Someone spoke up. In June 2001, Kenneth Atkinson, one of Lauren's abusers, decided to reveal her existence and the horrors she was enduring. His motives remain unclear to this day. Was it a sudden pang of guilt? A flicker of humanity breaking through his otherwise cruel nature? Or was it something more sinister, perhaps a calculated act of revenge after discovering that Barbara, his wife and accomplice, had been unfaithful? Whatever his reasons, his decision to speak out became the catalyst for ending Lauren's years of torment. Can you imagine that moment? For 6 years, Lauren had lived in a dark, suffocating closet, her existence hidden from the outside world. The abuse and neglect she suffered had become so routine, so normalized within the walls of that home, that it's almost unbelievable to think it could have gone on for so long without intervention. But Kenneth's words set off a chain reaction that would finally bring her nightmare to an end. When authorities arrived at the Atkinson home, they couldn't have been prepared for what they were about to uncover. Officers were responding to allegations of abuse, but nothing could have prepared them for the scene they walked into. They found Lauren, a child who at 8 years old was so small and frail that she looked like a toddler. Her body was emaciated, her skin pale and bruised, and her eyes reflected years of unimaginable suffering. The officers also discovered the tiny closet where Lauren had been confined for most of her life. The carpet inside was so soaked with urine that the officers' shoes were drenched as they walked through it. The stench was overwhelming, a physical reminder of the years of neglect Lauren had endured. The closet wasn't just a space, it was a prison that held the echoes of her cries, her fears, and her loneliness. In that moment, as Lauren was carried out of the house and into the sunlight, her life changed forever. For the first time in years, she was free. Free from the darkness of the closet, free from the torment of her abusers, and free to begin the long and difficult journey of healing. But the rescue wasn't just a moment of liberation. It was also a moment of reckoning. The authorities had uncovered a level of abuse that shocked even the most seasoned professionals. Lauren's condition was a stark indictment of a system that had failed her time and time again. How could a child endure such cruelty for so long without anyone noticing or intervening? These were the questions that would haunt those involved in the case. For Lauren, the rescue was the beginning of a new chapter, but it wasn't the end of her struggles. The physical scars on her body and the emotional scars on her heart were reminders of the years she had lost. Yet for the first time there was hope. Hope that the little girl who had survived so much could finally begin to heal. After years of confinement and unimaginable abuse, Lauren Kavanaugh's rescue marked the start of her journey toward freedom and healing. But transitioning into a normal life wasn't easy. For most children, the basics of daily life, using utensils, walking on grass, or trusting that their next meal will come, are learned and taken for granted. For Lauren, these were all foreign concepts. Her years of isolation had left her unprepared for even the simplest experiences of the outside world. Lauren struggled to adjust to her new environment. She had never been toilet trained and didn't know how to use a fork or a spoon. Something as simple as sitting at a table for a meal was overwhelming. Having lived in a state of constant deprivation, she would fiercely guard her food, clinging to it with all her might, terrified that someone might take it away. Food had been such a rare and precious commodity in her life that even in safety, she couldn't shake the fear that it could disappear at any moment. One moment from Lauren's early days of freedom is particularly heartbreaking. The first time she stepped outside barefoot, she burst into tears. She cried because she thought bugs were biting her feet, but in reality, it was the unfamiliar sensation of grass against her skin. Think about that. She had spent several years of her life locked away in darkness, so much so that the feeling of grass, something so simple and natural, was completely alien to her. It wasn't just the grass. The world itself was unfamiliar, a vast and overwhelming place she hadn't had the chance to explore or experience. For Lauren, even moments that should have brought joy came with fear and uncertainty. She had been conditioned to view the world through a lens of survival, where every moment was fraught with danger, and every experience came with the risk of pain. Learning to trust her new environment, the people around her, and even her own safety was an uphill battle. Her caregivers had to teach her everything, from the basics of self-care to how to enjoy the world outside. Imagine how patient and gentle they had to be, slowly introducing her to things that most of us would never think twice about. Things like the sound of birds, the feel of sunlight on her skin, or the simple act of sitting at a table and eating a meal without fear. Despite everything she had endured, she began taking her first steps, literally and figuratively, toward a new life. The scars of her early years, both physical and emotional, have left an indelible mark on her path forward. Meanwhile, Kenneth and Barbara Atkinson, the people who inflicted so much harm on Lauren, are both serving life sentences for felony injury to a child. Truly, trauma doesn't just end when the abuse stops. It lingers, it shapes you, and it takes a lot of work to overcome. At the end of the day, her story is a call to all of us to do better, to pay attention, to step in, and to make sure no child ever has to go through what Lauren did.